The Slow Walkers Club, a funny and cozy bedtime story. The notification appeared on Jamie's phone at 7:30 on a Monday morning in early January, bright and insistent against the gray light filtering through the bedroom curtains. It was from the fitness tracker wrapped around their wrist, the one they'd charged with such determination on New Year's Eve just 9 days ago. "You haven't moved in 3 days, it announced, as if delivering a diagnosis. "Time to get active." Jamie stared at the message, feeling the familiar weight of January settling on their chest, the weight of resolutions half made and already half broken, the weight of the expensive running shoes sitting by the door, worn exactly once before the polar vortex had swept through and made the idea of outdoor exercise seem like punishment rather than self-improvement, the weight of being 32 years old and feeling like every single January began with the same promises and ended with the same quiet failures. They rolled over and reached for their laptop, opening it to the collection of tabs they'd left open from their New Year's planning session. 10 steps to transform your body, 15 minutes to a new you, 21 days to build habits that stick. The advice all blurred together into a chorus of urgency and optimization, all of it making Jamie feel more exhausted than inspired. That's when they saw it. A PDF flyer that had somehow made its way into their downloads folder, probably from the community center's email newsletter that they never actually read. "Wednesday morning walking group," it announced in cheerful blue letters. "All fitness levels welcome. Meet at Riverside Park, 9 o'clock, a walking group. Not running, not high-intensity interval training, not any of the punishing routines that made Jamie's muscles ache just thinking about them. Just walking." And it was Wednesday morning, which meant Jamie could do it before logging into work. No excuses about being too tired after a long day at the office. Jamie sat up in bed, making a decision before they could talk themselves out of it. They would go. They would join this walking group. They would finally actually genuinely stick to a resolution this year. By Wednesday morning, Jamie had prepared. They'd laid out their gear the night before with military precision. The moisture-wicking shirt in electric blue, the running tights with reflective stripes down the sides, the neon yellow windbreaker that made them visible from approximately 3 miles away, the running shoes with their space-age cushioning and arch support that had cost more than Jamie cared to admit, and of course the fitness tracker fully charged and ready to count every single step. They'd set their alarm for 7, giving themselves plenty of time to eat a proper breakfast and do some dynamic stretches they'd learned from a YouTube video. By 8:30, Jamie was doing lunges in their living room, feeling virtuous and energized and ready to transform their life, one Wednesday morning at a time. The drive to Riverside Park took 12 minutes. Jamie arrived at 8:55, parking near the entrance and scanning the area for their fellow fitness enthusiasts. They expected to see a cluster of people in similar gear, maybe some stretching against the park benches, perhaps someone leading warm-up exercises. What they saw instead was a small group of people standing near the information board, and every single one of them appeared to be over the age of 70. Jamie checked their phone, wondering if they'd somehow gotten the time wrong or if there were multiple walking groups. But no, this had to be it. There were 7 people gathered in a loose circle, chatting amiably, and they were definitely waiting for something. An elderly woman in a wool coat the color of burgundy wine noticed Jamie and waved. "Hello there. Are you here for the Wednesday walkers?" Jamie approached slowly, suddenly very aware of how their outfit glowed in the winter morning light. Yes, I saw the flyer. Wonderful. The woman extended a gloved hand. I'm Mrs. Higgins. I'm so glad to see a fresh face. We're always delighted when someone new joins us. Jamie shook her hand, trying not to stare at the group. Mrs. Higgins wore sensible boots and carried a large thermos. Next to her stood a tall man with binoculars hanging around his neck, introducing himself as Harold. There was Dorothy in her hand-knitted scarf, and Arthur with his walking stick, and Patricia, who kept checking her watch, and two others whose names Jamie immediately forgot in their confusion. Is this, Jamie began, then stopped, trying to find a polite way to phrase the question. Is this the only walking group? The Wednesday morning one? It is indeed, Mrs. Higgins said warmly. We've been meeting every Wednesday for the past 6 years, rain, shine, or snow. Well, mostly. We did skip a few weeks during that particularly nasty ice storm in 2021, but otherwise we're quite dedicated. Jamie nodded slowly, already calculating how to make a graceful exit. They could claim they'd forgotten something in the car. They could say they'd mixed up the dates. They could simply walk away and never look back, return to their apartment and search for a different, more age-appropriate fitness group. But Mrs. Higgins was looking at them with such genuine warmth, and Harold was telling an animated story about spotting a Cooper S-Hawk last week, and the whole group had an air of such comfortable companionship that Jamie found themselves staying put. Well then, Mrs. Higgins said, checking a delicate watch on her wrist. Shall we begin? Our usual route? The group murmured agreement and began moving toward the trail entrance. Jamie fell into step with them, immediately noticing that their idea of walking and this group's idea of walking were not quite the same thing. The pace was, to be generous, leisurely. Jamie's fitness tracker normally celebrated when they hit 15-minute miles. This group was moving at what could only be described as a contemplative stroll. Jamie tried to match their stride, taking smaller steps, but it felt unnatural, like trying to walk in slow motion. They kept wanting to surge ahead, to set a pace that would actually make their heart rate climb into the training zone. The trail wound through Riverside Park, following a creek that was currently frozen at the edges, the water moving in a slow, dark ribbon down the center. The bare trees stretched overhead, their branches creating intricate patterns against the pale gray sky. It was the kind of morning where every breath turned visible in the cold air, where the light had that particular quality of winter. Oh, look, Mrs. Higgins said suddenly, coming to a complete stop. Frost patterns on the fence. Aren't they lovely? The entire group stopped with her, crowding around to look at the wooden fence that bordered the trail. Jamie stood at the back, rising slightly on their toes to peer over shoulders. Look how the crystals have formed in perfect lines, Harold said, leaning in close, following the grain of the wood. Beautiful, Dorothy agreed. Like lace, they stood there for what felt like an eternity to Jamie, examining the frost. Jamie's fitness tracker recorded each passing second with indifferent precision. 5 minutes at 0.3 miles per hour. Their heart rate dropping steadily back to resting levels. Should we, Jamie finally ventured, keep moving? Mrs. Higgins glanced over with a smile. Oh yes, of course. I just wanted everyone to see that. It won't last once the sun climbs higher. They resumed walking, continuing along the trail at the same unhurried pace. Jamie tried to appreciate the scenery, the peaceful quiet of the winter morning, but their mind kept returning to calculations. At this rate, they'd be lucky to cover 2 miles in the full hour. That was barely enough to count as exercise. Their fitness tracker would probably log it as light activity rather than a proper workout. 20 minutes into the walk, Harold raised one hand, signaling a stop. "There," he whispered, pointing toward a cluster of bushes. "Do you see it?" The group fell silent, following his gaze. Jamie looked and saw nothing but bare branches and dried seed heads. "What are we looking for?" Jamie whispered back. "The cardinal," Harold breathed. "Male, magnificent red plumage. There, on the third branch from the bottom." Jamie squinted and finally spotted it. A bright red bird, sitting perfectly still, surveying its domain. The group watched in silence, and Jamie had to admit it was a beautiful bird, vivid against the muted colors of winter. But after 30 seconds of watching, Jamie's patience began to fray. "Should we double quotes, Dorothy said gently. "He's about to call." And indeed, a moment later, the cardinal let out a series of sharp, whistling notes that echoed through the quiet morning. The group made appreciative sounds, and Harold raised his binoculars for a better look. This continued. The group walked for perhaps 50 feet, then stopped to examine a particularly interesting piece of bark on a tree. They walked another 100 feet, then paused to watch a squirrel preparing its winter nest. They stopped to look at the way ice had formed in geometric patterns along the creek bank. They stopped to examine seed pods hanging from a tree branch. They stopped to point out animal tracks in the patches of snow that still lingered in the shadows. At 45 minutes into the walk, they encountered the mossy rock. It sat just off the trail, about the size of a small car, covered in a thick coat of moss and lichen that had turned various shades of green and gray in the winter cold. Frost had settled into every crevice, creating a miniature landscape of crystals and tiny frozen droplets. "Now that," Mrs. Higgins said, setting down her thermos with a decisive thunk, "is something we need to look at properly." The entire group migrated toward the rock like iron filings to a magnet. They surrounded it, leaning in from all sides, making observations. "Look at the different species of moss," Harold said. "At least 3 distinct types. The lichen formation is remarkable," Arthur added, tapping his walking stick against the ground for emphasis. "That orange species there, that's a particularly hardy one. Thrives in cold conditions." Jamie stood at the edge of the group, feeling their frustration mounting. They had been walking for almost an hour and had covered, according to their tracker, approximately 1.2 miles. 1.2 miles. They could have walked that distance by pacing in their apartment. "This is fascinating," Mrs. Higgins was saying, "but I think we need to examine the northern side. The shade there might have preserved different patterns." The group shuffled around to the north side of the rock, and Jamie felt something inside them snap. "We should keep moving," Jamie said, louder than intended. "We haven't even reached the halfway point of the trail yet." The group turned to look at them. Mrs. Higgins tilted her head, her expression curious rather than offended. "Oh, we rarely do the full loop," she said. "Not in winter, anyway. We take our time, see what there is to see, but we're not really," Jamie searched for the words, "we're not really exercising. We're just standing still, looking at a rock." "Are we?" Mrs. Higgins asked, and there was something in her tone that wasn't quite a challenge, but wasn't quite agreement either. "I suppose it depends on what you came here to exercise." Before Jamie could respond, their fitness tracker buzzed against their wrist. They looked down at the notification and felt their face flush with embarrassment. "Looks like you've stopped moving," the message read. "Are you okay?" The device thought they'd fallen asleep while standing up. Dorothy had noticed. "What does it say, dear?" Jamie wanted to lie, but the whole situation was so absurd that the truth came tumbling out. "It thinks I've stopped moving. It's asking if I'm okay." There was a moment of silence, and then Harold began to laugh. It started as a chuckle and grew into a full, hearty laugh that made his binoculars bounce against his chest. Soon the others joined in, and even Mrs. Higgins was smiling widely. "Well," Mrs. Higgins said once the laughter had subsided, "I suppose in the strictest technical sense, it's correct. We have stopped moving in the way machines measure movement, but we're still moving," Dorothy added softly. "Just in other ways." Jamie didn't understand what she meant, but before they could ask, Mrs. Higgins had turned back to the rock, gesturing to a particular patch of moss. "Come look at this, Jamie," she said. "Truly look at it. Tell me what you see." Jamie stepped closer, more out of politeness than genuine interest. They looked at where Mrs. Higgins was pointing. Just moss, green and slightly fuzzy, and entirely unremarkable. "I see moss," Jamie said. "Look closer." Jamie leaned in, squinting. And slowly, as their eyes adjusted and they actually paid attention, they began to see details they'd missed. The moss wasn't just green. It was dozens of shades of green, from deep emerald to pale sage. Tiny frost crystals clung to individual fronds, catching what little light filtered through the clouds. And there, nestled in a small depression in the moss, was a ladybug, bright red and perfectly still, hibernating through the winter. "Oh," Jamie said softly. "There," Mrs. Higgins said with satisfaction. "Now you're seeing it." They stood there for another few minutes, the group pointing out other details. The way water had frozen in droplets along the edge of the rock, like a string of glass beads. The pattern of the lichen spreading in circular formations. The texture of the stone itself, rough and pitted with age. When they finally moved on, continuing their slow progress along the trail, Jamie found themselves paying more attention. Not to their fitness tracker or their pace or their heart rate, but to the park itself. The sound of their boots crunching on the gravel path. The way that sound changed when they stepped on frozen grass, sharp and crisp. The distant call of chickadees, their voices high and clear in the cold air. The smell of winter, clean and sharp, and somehow both empty and full at the same time. "Tell me," Mrs. Higgins said, falling into step beside Jamie, "what brought you to our little group?" Jamie hesitated, then decided on honesty. New Year's resolution. "I wanted to get more exercise." "Ah," Mrs. Higgins said with understanding. "And how is that going for you so far this year?" "Not great, if I'm being honest," Jamie admitted. "This was supposed to be the year I actually stuck with something, but I keep failing before I even really start." Mrs. Higgins nodded thoughtfully. They walked in silence for a moment, the only sound the crunch of their footsteps and the distant murmur of the creek. "I used to be a librarian," Mrs. Higgins said eventually. "Worked at the Central Library downtown for 37 years, and I was very good at my job because I was very efficient. I could process returned books faster than anyone. I could help 3 patrons at once, all while keeping the circulation desk perfectly organized. I prided myself on my speed." She paused to let Harold point out a cluster of ice formations on a fallen log. "When I retired," she continued, "I kept that same energy. I joined 3 volunteer organizations. I took up watercolor painting and signed up for classes. I committed to walking 10,000 steps a day. I scheduled every hour of every day because that's what I'd always done. If I was awake, I was being productive. They reached a small wooden bridge that crossed the creek, and the group stopped to look at the water flowing beneath. And I was miserable, Mrs. Higgins said. Absolutely miserable. I was busier in retirement than I'd been while working. I wasn't enjoying any of it because I was always rushing to the next thing. What changed? Jamie asked. My daughter came to visit, Mrs. Higgins said, and she watched me for a weekend and then sat me down and said, Mom, you're going to burn yourself out. When are you going to stop racing toward the finish line? And I said, What finish line? And she said, Exactly. Mrs. Higgins smiled at the memory. That's when I started this walking group. Specifically, this walking group. Slow, meandering, with no particular destination or goal except to notice what's around. U.S. But don't you worry about, Jamie gestured vaguely, wasting time, not accomplishing anything? Oh, I accomplished quite a lot, Mrs. Higgins said. I saw that cardinal today. I noticed the way the frost formed on that fence. I found a hibernating ladybug. I had a conversation with you. Those are all accomplishments. My fitness tracker doesn't think so, Jamie said ruefully. Mrs. Higgins laughed. Well, your fitness tracker is a very clever piece of technology, I'm sure, but it only knows how to measure one kind of movement. It can't measure the movement that happens here. She tapped her chest over her heart. Or here, she tapped her temple. The group had begun moving again, continuing across the bridge and onto the far side of the creek. Harold called back that he'd spotted a hawk in the distance, and everyone stopped to watch it soar. Jamie looked up at the bird, watching it circle lazily in the gray sky. And for the first time since they'd arrived at the park, they weren't thinking about their pace or their heart rate, or how many calories they were burning. They were just watching a hawk fly. I'm not saying that exercise isn't important, Mrs. Higgins said quietly, her eyes on the hawk, or that goals and resolutions are wrong. But sometimes the fastest way forward is to slow down. Sometimes you have to stop measuring everything and just be present in what's actually happening. The hawk disappeared behind a stand of trees, and the group continued walking. But Jamie noticed something had shifted. They weren't as frustrated with the pace anymore. Instead, they found themselves looking around, really looking at the winter landscape they'd been too impatient to notice before. Arthur told a story about ice fishing on this creek when he was a boy, back when winters were colder and the ice froze thick enough to support a person's weight. Patricia pointed out a patch of evergreen ferns, still vibrant beneath the snow, and explained how they stayed green all winter by producing a natural antifreeze in their cells. Dorothy handed around cookies from her bag, homemade ginger snaps that tasted like cinnamon and molasses and warmth, and Mrs. Higgins opened her thermos, pouring out small cups of hot chocolate for anyone who wanted some. The steam rose in delicate spirals in the cold air, and Jamie wrapped their hands around the paper cup, feeling the warmth seep through the cardboard. This is chamomile, Mrs. Higgins said, pouring her own cup. Well, chamomile and honey and just a touch of vanilla. My own recipe. I find it's perfect for Wednesday mornings. The sound of her thermos opening and closing, the click of the lid, the faint scent of chamomile mixing with the cold, clean smell of winter, the warmth of the cup in Jamie's hands. These small, specific details that the fitness tracker couldn't measure or quantify. They stood there in a loose circle, sipping their drinks, talking about nothing important and everything important at the same time. Dorothy mentioned her granddaughter's upcoming recital. Harold discussed the documentary about birds he'd watched last night. Arthur complained good-naturedly about his doctor's appointment next week. And Jamie realized they were participating in something they hadn't experienced in a long time. Community, connection, the simple pleasure of being with other people without any agenda except to be together. When they finally headed back toward the parking lot, Jamie checked their fitness tracker one last time. They'd walked a total of 1.7 miles in just over 90 minutes. By any conventional measure, it was not an impressive workout. But Jamie felt different than they had when they'd arrived. The anxious, driven energy that had propelled them out of bed that morning had eased. The tight feeling in their chest, the one that always accompanied their thoughts about New Year's resolutions and self-improvement, had loosened. "So," Mrs. Higgins said as they reached the parking lot, "will we see you next Wednesday?" Jamie looked at the group, at Harold with his binoculars and his encyclopedic knowledge of birds, at Dorothy with her knitted scarves and her homemade cookies, at Arthur with his stories of the way things used to be, at Mrs. Higgins with her thermos of chamomile tea and her gentle wisdom. "Yes," Jamie said, "I'll be here." Mrs. Higgins smiled. "Wonderful. And perhaps next week you might leave the tracker at home?" Jamie laughed. "Maybe. We'll see." That week, Jamie thought about the walk more than they'd expected to. The memory of it kept surfacing at odd moments. During a particularly stressful meeting at work, they'd find themselves thinking about that frozen creek, the dark water moving slowly beneath the ice. Standing in line at the grocery store, they remembered Mrs. Higgins' words about finish lines. By the time Wednesday rolled around again, Jamie was looking forward to the walk in a way they hadn't anticipated. They still wore their workout clothes, but this time they'd chosen warmer, more comfortable layers instead of the high-performance gear, and they'd left the neon windbreaker at home. The group greeted them like an old friend, and they set off on the trail together. This time, Jamie didn't check their fitness tracker every 5 minutes. When Harold stopped to point out a woodpecker on a distant tree, Jamie stopped too, watching the birds' rhythmic pecking without impatience. When they encountered an interesting patch of ice formations along the creek bank, Jamie leaned in to look, noticing the way the water had frozen in layers, creating striations of clear and cloudy ice. "You're getting the hang of it," Dorothy said approvingly. 3 weeks in, something unexpected happened. Jamie's boss commented on their performance in a meeting, noting that they seemed more focused, more present. Jamie hadn't made any conscious changes to their work style, but they realized that the act of slowing down on Wednesday mornings was starting to affect how they approached the rest of the week. When a project deadline loomed, instead of panicking and working frantically, Jamie took a breath and broke the work into manageable pieces. When a colleague sent a frustrating email instead of firing off an immediate response, Jamie took a short walk around the building and came back with a clearer perspective. 5 weeks in, Jamie brought their own thermos to the walk. Not chamomile tea, but hot coffee with cream, the way they'd always preferred it, but never had time to enjoy because they were always rushing. "Look at you," Mrs. Higgins said with delight when she saw the thermos. A proper slow walker now. The group laughed, and Jamie realized it was true. They'd become part of this strange little club, the Slow Walkers, as Harold had started calling them. Every Wednesday morning, a group of people who had decided that getting nowhere quickly was better than rushing toward everywhere all at once. 8 weeks in early March, Jamie finally took off the fitness tracker before the walk. They left it sitting on the passenger seat of their car, its screen dark and silent. The first few minutes felt naked, like they were missing something essential. But then they forgot about it, absorbed in Patricia's story about her new great-grandchild. And by the time they remembered the tracker existed, the walk was nearly over. "How does it feel?" Mrs. Higgins asked, nodding at Jamie's bare wrist. "Strange," Jamie admitted, "but also kind of freeing." "Give it time," Mrs. Higgins said. "Sometimes we need permission to stop measuring our worth in numbers." Spring came gradually, as it always does. The ice on the creek melted. The frost patterns disappeared from the fences. Green shoots began pushing up through the dead leaves of last year, and the slow walkers continued their Wednesday morning ritual, noticing all of it. Jamie watched the seasons change in a way they never had before, not just in a general sense, but in specific, granular detail. The exact day when the first robin appeared, the week when the trees started budding, the morning when the air lost that sharp, cold edge and began to smell like growing things. And somewhere along the way, without really noticing the transition, the walks stopped being about a New Year's resolution. They stopped being about exercise or self-improvement or accomplishing anything measurable. They became simply what they were, a chance to spend time with friends, to notice the world, to move at a pace that allowed for reflection and observation and presence. One morning in April, as they stood watching the sunlight dance on the now free-flowing creek, Harold asked Jamie a question. Whatever happened to that fitness tracker? Jamie thought about it. The tracker was in a drawer at home now, occasionally charging but rarely worn. They still exercised sometimes, took longer walks on the weekends, went to a yoga class that Dorothy had recommended. But the frantic energy around it, the sense of obligation and failure, had faded. "I guess I realized I was trying to track the wrong things," Jamie said. "And what should you have been tracking?" Mrs. Higgins asked. Jamie looked around at the group, at the spring morning, clear and bright, at the new leaves just beginning to unfurl on the trees, at the way the water sparkled in the sunlight. "This," Jamie said simply. "All of this." Mrs. Higgins smiled and poured them all tea from her thermos. They stood there in the spring sunshine, drinking chamomile and honey, in no rush to be anywhere else. And Jamie thought about the person they'd been that first January morning, arriving at the park in neon gear, determined to finally achieve something. That person had been measuring success in steps and miles and heart rate zones. That person had been so focused on the destination that they'd forgotten to notice the journey. This person, the one standing here in April with bare wrists and a thermos of coffee, had learned something that no fitness tracker could quantify. That slowing down wasn't the same as standing still. That presence was its own kind of progress. That sometimes the most radical thing you could do in a world that demanded constant forward motion was to simply stand still and look at a mossy rock for 10 minutes. The walks continued through spring and into summer. The group remained constant, the 7 original members plus Jamie, meeting every Wednesday morning at 9 o'clock. They saw the park through every season, every weather condition, every shift of light and temperature. And Jamie never did complete that New Year's resolution, the one about getting more exercise. But they did complete something else, something they hadn't known they needed. They learned to slow down. They learned to notice. They learned that life wasn't a race with a finish line, but a walk with infinite opportunities to pause and look around. Mrs. Higgins had been right. The fastest way forward was sometimes to slow down, and once Jamie understood that, everything else began to fall into place. If this story resonated with you, please consider showing your support with a like and subscribe to Deep Sleep Stories Hub for more quiet nights and restful journeys. May your dreams be peaceful, and may you wake refreshed, carrying with you the gentle reminder that sometimes the most profound changes come not from racing ahead, but from learning to walk at a pace that lets you see where you are.